Our first gastropod we're going to talk about is called a conch, and it's pronounced with a hard C, conch. It's not a conch. They're traditionally found in southern warm waters on the Atlantic side of America. We like to recall, we call that North Carolina to Brazil. They are saltwater animals. They are also protected now in many places, and there are farms that I'll show you coming up. The conch is basically a snail, and you can buy small conch and large conch. Conch, like a land-based animal, gets tougher the bigger they are, yet they develop more flavor. So if you compare like veal to steer, you have one is tender and mild, and one is tough and flavorful. So depending on the dish, you have to pick what you want. Something like a chowder, which you're going to braise for a long time, I would go with maybe a tougher, older, more flavorful one, whereas something like ceviche, maybe try to get more young, tender ones. You can simmer the conch for a long period of time, right, to cook it, cool it down, and then use it for other dishes. This slide, you can actually see the conch. The picture at about 9 o'clock, you can see a little bit of the animal sticking out of the shell. These are not to be confused with hermit crabs. They do not leave their shell when they need a bigger one. The shell actually grows with the animal. On the far right, at about 1 o'clock, there's a guy with a hammer and a drift, and he's poking holes in the shell so he can slide a knife in there and release it, much like releasing a clam or an oyster off its shell. And at the 12 o'clock picture, you can see the animal being released and removed. That brown membrane would be peeled off, and you'd have nice white flesh underneath it. In the bottom right, that's a conch farm in the Bahamas. To me, one of the most beautiful farms I've ever seen. At 6 o'clock, you have some conch that's pounded out and drying, and that is in Southeast Asia, where they would use it in soups and stews, maybe even spring rolls. Not to be outdone by the East Coast, on the West Coast, from California all the way over to Asia, is another underwater snail called the abalone. The abalone in America is farmed traditionally because it's the number one food of the sea otter, which you see down below. And sea otters being endangered, they already have enough going against them. You can't take food away from them. So abalone come in many sizes. The bottom left-hand corner picture, that's called the Abalone Farm. It's in Northern California, and they will ship us abalone at times. We can buy them alive in the shell, like the picture at 3 o'clock. We can buy them frozen in the shell, or, as the bottom right-hand picture shows, we can buy them shucked and cleaned. It's a very expensive item, probably the most expensive shellfish I know. They average around $110 a pound, but very versatile. You can slice it for sashimi, you can lightly grill it, you can pound it out and pan fry it. Escargot are a mollusk as well. They are just happen to be a land-based snail. We can get them alive, like the bottom right-hand corner. We can buy them frozen in the shell, or we can buy them more readily available canned. If you buy them farmed, you can see the farm in the center of the picture. That's in Northern California, where everything seems to grow. That's on the side of the highway. The picture at 9 o'clock would be a close-up. You can see the gastropod, the stomach-footed animal, crawling around on its foot, and they just eat all the greenery, which gives them an herbaceous, earthy flavor. A picture on the top right, very traditional presentation of escargot bourguignon, which is snails with herb butter. So parsley, garlic, and butter, packed inside a shell, roasted off, served, with the traditional dimple dish and the tongs. Alternately, you could saute them. You could stuff little puff pastries with these and not have to buy the shells or the tongs or the small forks. Many, many uses. At 6 o'clock, you can see snail caviar. This is fairly new to the market. It's about $27 an ounce. And it's got that earthy flavor profile of, earth, leaves and dirt. When we talk about clams, there's two varieties of clams. Well, first off, clams are bivalves. They have two shells that open and close. The most common variety on the East Coast is the quahog. Quahogs come in 4 market sizes. You have the little neck, top neck, cherrystone, and chowder. And they also, like the conch we mentioned, get tougher the bigger they are. So traditionally on the East Coast and other places that these are served, the little necks and the top necks are served on the half shell raw, and the larger ones are cooked. Now, That being said, the little ones can also be used as an internal garnish. So if I was going to make a clam chowder, I may use a chowder clam, which is tough and flavorful, and grind it up and braise it down, and then garnish the soup with a couple of little neck clams in the shell on top. Or Connecticut clam pizza is quite famous, where they put the clams on the white pizza and put it in the oven for them to open up and cook. You may also notice that those sizes overlap, right? Where one top neck ends, cherry stone begins. Being that cherry stone probably sounds more appetizing to people, you may notice clam bars in the East Coast have little necks and cherry stones. But those cherry stones are just basically large top necks with a more appealing name. Here are a few other hard-shell clams that we get to see on campus. From Maine, the dark-shelled mahogany clam, very similar to a quahog, except it has a darker shell. The further north you go in the water, the higher the nutrient content and the brinier it is, so they may register in your palate as a saltier clam, but beautiful nonetheless. Rescued from Manila Bay in the Philippines is a Manila clam that's now cultivated in the Pacific Northwest. It's a very small clam, not generally eaten on the half shell, but great as a pasta clam or an internal garnish, a soup, a stew, a stir fry. If you put your thumb and forefinger together, that's about the size they are. They'll fit right in there. At the same size of that is the cockle, sometimes referred to as cockle clam or duck clam. Also the same shape, but it's got a green, white, and brown shell. Called a duck clam because if you look to the right of that picture, the mallard, or the male duck, has the same coloring, right? Green into a little band of white and then into brown. Maybe you can see that in the clamshell. Not all clams are hard. Some are brittle and fragile, like the soft-shell clams. The most common soft-shell clam is called the Ipswich clam. It's from Massachusetts, and as you can see, it has a siphon which extends from its body. That siphon will be used for filter feeding. This clam buries itself in the sand, draws water in through that tube, goes into its belly, extracts the nutrients, and expels the rest of the water. Thus the other name that's up there. Also called a steamer because traditionally these clams are steamed in beer and served with drawn butter. You'd remove it from the shell, take that siphon, and peel back the membrane. The membrane extends all the way the length of the shell, so it keeps sand out while the animal's alive. Usually dunked in the cooking liquid to rinse it off, and then put into drawn butter or any other type of sauce, and then eaten. On the bottom right, you can see that they're fried. Some people like to shuck these clams, batter them and fry them, and in the New England area, you'll see them listed as fried belly clams or fried clam bellies. On the bottom left, for our California students, you have horse clams. Very similar in nature, same shape, a little larger, but basically the same type of clam. If you're fortunate enough to work in a restaurant with a bigger budget, you might see razor clams. Razor clams are a long shell. They look like a straight edge razor, thus the name. And you see these in European restaurants, Asian restaurants, the Pacific Northwest when they make po' boy sandwiches. In Oregon, they used to do breaded and fried razor clams. On the East Coast, it's a very challenging license to get. I think there's less than 24 razor clam fishermen on Cape Cod. So we get them occasionally, but not as much as I would like to see them. And then from the Pacific Northwest, the gooey duck. It's not pronounced geoduck, it's gooey duck. They are all farmed, so they can mitigate environmental damage, but it's basically a tremendous soft-shell clam used in sashimi or pan-fried or sautéed. Very delicious, sweet, briny, crunchy. If you have an opportunity, please try it. Oysters, which have been eaten forever, have 4 main varieties. We have the Atlantic strain, the Pacific strain, the Europeans, and the Japanese. With each of those, there are many, many, many sub-varieties. But for what we need to know is if you see an oyster like the top right-hand corner with a smooth lip, chances are it's an Atlantic oyster. Now, they range from Canada all the way down to Florida and the Gulf of Mexico. The Pacific oyster tends to have a jagged edge or a fluted edge, as you can see in the second picture. European oysters, very strong. You have to work your way up to these. This is not an amateur's oyster. Tend to have a wider, flatter shell. You can see that it almost resembles more of a scallop shape, and there's even one sitting vertically in the ice. You can see how narrow they are. And then my personal favorite, the Japanese strain, the Kumamoto, which is one of the most heavily farmed oysters on the planet. It's farmed in Japan, Washington, Canada, Oregon, California. Tastes like cucumbers. It's really nice. So the Atlantics can range anywhere from briny to popcorny to herby. Pacifics tend to taste very melony. The Bellones, kind of coppery and metallic. And then the Japanese, which is that beautiful cucumber aroma. When you see oysters, first off, if they're on the half shell, a southern oyster, especially on the East Coast, is going to tend to be opaque. You're not going to be able to see through the animal. If you compare that to the one on the right, the northern oyster, they're going to be more translucent. You can almost see the different layers. On your palate, the oysters from the south are going to tend to be fattier and creamier and not very distinct in flavor. The ones on the right, the northerns, like we mentioned, the further north you go, the brinier and the more nutrient-dense the water, they're going to get a lot more complex in flavor. And maybe into an amateur taster, they'll just taste the salt first before they can drill down onto the specific characteristics. Those characteristics and names will always come from where the animal is raised. So if it's a Wellfleet, it comes from Wellfleet, Massachusetts, traditionally thought of as buttery, briny, almost buttered movie theater popcorn. Mussels, a Cinderella story, which just used to be a nuisance, are now highly prized. They're fairly inexpensive. They grow in a year. You're looking at something that's wholesale, about $2 a pound. If you're going to serve an entree-size portion, like the Moules frites in the bottom left, I would recommend 1 pound per person. Now, I always talk about in class how you should serve a 4-ounce portion of protein, but let's take into account we got some shell weight here. They're traditionally farm-raised. Roughly 98% of mussels come from farms. You can see in the bottom right, there's a rope. Those started off in either a cage or a disintegrating bag as a little sprat, and they attach to the rope with their byssus threads. Some people refer to them as a beard. And then they just sit there under those crossbars in the top right, and they filter feed as the water passes through. Sometimes they're raised on the bottom, but that's going to give you although maybe slightly more flavorful mussel, one that should definitely go through a depuration tank because they're going to be gritty on the inside. Not to be outdone by America, the rest of the world has mussels too. There's the green lip mussel, which is from the southern hemisphere. They're slightly larger than the black, blue, or Mediterranean mussels, and a lot of people can't justify the price of them because they're about twice the price of the black mussel. I want you to keep in mind from a chef's or business perspective that when you see them at $4.50 a pound, they're generally frozen on the half shell, individually quickly frozen, right? So they're going to come in a box. You're going to have 100% yield. There's going to be no broken ones. They're slightly larger. So right there, I can justify it. Also, you have the wow factor. Most people have never seen a green lip mussel, and black mussels are as common as dishwater. So you might get someone to say, hey, wow, this is really cool. Maybe they'll do some social media marketing for you. Maybe they'll tell their friends about it. A very popular restaurant bivalve is scallops. Most of us are just used to seeing scallops come already shucked, but you could get them on the half shell, in which case the easiest way to tell their sex is you look at the roe. You may see an orange roe sac, which is indicative of a female. That's the hard roe or eggs, or the yellowish whitish roe, which is called soft roe, which is the milt from the male. We generally eat the adductor muscle, and when you talk about physiology, adductors, think about your bicep. When you close your arm, your bicep flexes. So all that muscle does is flex and release and flex and release, and that's how the scallop can propel itself through the water. There's a link on the next page, which if you click on it, will take you to show you how scallops swim. On this page, you can see a great example of a scallop on a half shell. A lot of restaurants in the United States do not sell them like this because it's a very visually disconcerting thing for people to look at. But if you look at the bottom left-hand side, you'll see a schematic of everything you're looking at. So if you take that scallop and maybe remove the very dark viscera in the back, lightly broil it, squeeze a lemon on top of it, I'll tell you, there's nothing much more you need in life. You're looking at what's called a base scallop. We know it's a bay scallop because it has a fluted or jagged or scalloped edge, whereas the sea scallops tend to be smoother. You can buy large bay scallops. You can buy them even alive. They'll put a rubber band on them to keep the two shells as tightly closed as possible, or you can buy them shucked. The market forms for scallops are either going to be live with tags, in which case hold on to that tag for 90 days after the last one's done, but more often, like I've mentioned, they're purchased shucked. In the can or tub, they're either going to be dry pack or wet pack. Dry pack indicates that it's just the scallop adductor muscle and nothing else. When they're wet or washed, they add a concentrate called sodium tripolyphosphate, which is going to preserve them through almost a brine, and it's going to tend to bleach them, and it's going to increase the water volume. Now that could be a little bit of a misleading thing, because if you buy scallops that are wet packed and they're 25% water, for every 10 pounds of scallops you buy, you just bought 2.5 pounds of water at probably $10 a pound. Lastly, when you buy scallops, you're going to have to figure out what type you want. We have two main varieties. There's bay scallops, which are traditionally smaller but can get quite large, usually found in inlets or inland waterways. Usually the best ones are from cold water, and in my opinion, and many chefs share the same feeling, is the Nantucket bay scallops, which are available for a very short time a year, are some of the best, but that comes at a price. They're around $30 a pound, but I swear you can eat them right out of the bag. It's like eating candy. The larger traditional scallops are called sea scallops. They're usually dredged offshore. They come up in these gigantic cages that are kind of have a cutting blade on the front end. If you look up New Bedford dredge, NEW space BEDFORD, New Bedford scallop dredge, you'll get a great sense of how these are cut off the bottom of the sea floor. You can buy diver scallops, which some people just think are large scallops, but they're technically can be any size. What they really are scallops that have been harvested by hand, one at a time, by a diver, quite often with bell helmets and gear to bring them to the bottom, but you could also swim around. It has nothing to do with the size, but you're going to pay a higher price for the labor. If you see the term dayboat scallop, that implies that the boat went out and came back in the same day, and your scallops are going to be slightly fresher. There are some boats that may go out for an extended period of time, shuck the scallops, put them in cans, and it's going to be a couple of days before you get them.